Everybody. We are here for this morning session of special lecture series. And today we have Mr. P.V. Balasubramaniam, who is going to give a talk on the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. I don't require a big introduction to be given for Mr. P.V. Balasubramaniam, as he is a very learned member in the bar. He completed his law graduation in the year 1997 from Dr. Ambedkar Government Law College. He had also completed his intermediate in cost and works accountancy. He had been a very interesting personality right from his college days. He was one of the first teams to represent India at the William C. Wyss International Arbitration Moot held in Vienna in the year 1997 as a student of Madras Law College. After his graduation, Mr. P.V. Balasubramaniam had joined the office of Mr. N.S. Sivam to start his practice as an advocate, which was part of the illustrious chamber of Mr. S. Govind Swaminathan. Every member who had been an opportunity to step into the chambers of Govind Swaminathan speaks volumes within the compound of Madras High Court and in the legal fraternity. Later in the year 2007, Mr. P.V. Balasubramaniam became part, having been one of the initial partners of BFS Legal. He had started the firm along with two of his colleagues. And today, the firm BFS Legal features in Legal 500 Asia Pacific as one of the most successful firms in Chennai. As you all aware, they have been having their practice in every branch and more particularly on the civil side of practice. Mr. Balasubramaniam had personally appeared in many forums, including Honorable Supreme Court, High Courts at Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka, apart from being a regular practitioner in the Madras High Court and the tribunals at Chennai, namely NCLT and DRT. He had also had his academics further tuned, not to stop with his college days. He had authored articles as part of Getting the Deal Through series published in association with International Bar Association in the fields of real estate and trademarks. Mr. Balasubramanian has been regularly contributing to the Ease of Doing Business survey conducted by the World Bank in the field of enforcement of contracts. As you are all aware, he has been very good at lectures. He had been part of the faculty to National Judicial Academy, Bhopal, various study circles of the Institute of Company Secretaries, law academies at Madurai and Chennai. So it is nice that we have Mr. Balasubramaniam talking to us on the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. It should help the younger generation in a big way as to the various learnings Mr. Balasubramaniam carries with him from the days of his college and which he is going to display to you. I hope every one of you will be benefited of it. And welcome, Mr. Balasubramaniam. The stage is now yours.
Thank you very much, Om sir. It's been a great privilege to have you introduce me to the listeners today. Since I have come up with this background of mine, I tend to believe whatever has been said. So thank you. I should also thank Suri for organizing this lecture series. After the lockdown has begun, a lot of people in our fraternity have found it very difficult to spend our time. We've spent so much time talking that such prolonged silence has been quite a curse. So these webinars and lecture series are our avenues to express whatever we have learned so far and continue learning. This is a knowledge sharing platform is what I would put it as. So what I am going to speak today would be more in the nature of sharing the knowledge that I have gained in course of my practice and reading in respect of this particular legislation. I request the audience to bear with me for any mistakes that I may make. We are all learning, and please feel free to correct me wherever I go wrong. Of course, Mr. Om is there. He's the expert without any doubt on this field. He's delivered many more lectures on IBC. So the topic that has been chosen today is on a broad overview of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. There is also a second part to the lecture, which is on the journey so far, insofar as the IBC is concerned. And why we are having it as two parts is for this reason. One, the first part serves to help such of those practitioners who have not stepped into the practice of IBC so far. And therefore, as I was saying, the first part of this lecture, which is the broad overview, is to help such of those practitioners who have not yet stepped into this field of practice and probably therefore have an idea of what the basics are and how to proceed. The idea is that if there is a client coming into us with a problem which arises out of IBC or for which the IBC could be used, we as lawyers would be in a position to give the advice and thereafter proceed further. The second part, which is on the journey so far, why that is significant in a manner of speaking, is that this is a very new legislation. It is in a very nascent stage. The provisions of the Act have been notified probably just about 3.5 years ago. Some of the provisions are yet to be notified. Despite that, in the last 3.5 years, there have been almost about 5 amendments to the Act. And the journey of IBC that I am talking about, we will try to cover what these amendments are about, how they've brought some changes to the way the Act was and how it is today. And of course, the jurisprudence on the subject from when the Act came into force initially to the present date. Of course, I will not be spending too much time on each and every judgment that has come about in the IBC. I will just speak to you about a few, very few significant judgments which touch on the broader aspects and say how the entire Act will now be looked at and what is possible, what is not possible. So this is a sort of a broad overview of the lecture itself, which is again an overview of the Act. So let us begin from the beginning. How did the code come into place in the very first instance? Now, an insolvency enactment which will deal with all aspects in respect of insolvency of corporate persons, individuals, other kinds of entities such as partnership firms or proprietary concerns is more or less the norm in the developed countries. For instance, if we take United Kingdom, the first of such enactments was made in 1986. And this, of course, underwent some changes and additions. There were new enactments which came to be added on. There were enactments made in the year 2000 and subsequently in 2002. But these enactments in UK comprehensively deal with insolvency and provide a very structured framework. If we take the case of USA, Chapter 11 bankruptcy is something which is very popular. Even those of us who have not dealt with bankruptcy before would have heard of a Chapter 11 filing, saying that the company has gone into bankruptcy. So Chapter 11 bankruptcy starts with the Bankruptcy Act, which was first brought into play in 1989. Even in the United States, subsequently, in the years 1994 and later on in 2005, there were new changes and additions to these enactments. And ultimately, what is prevalent today is what is as of 2005. Again, the reason why I am stressing about the prevalence of such insolvency enactments in the developed countries is to show that with the expansion of trade and commerce and with globalization, there comes a need where commercial interests of global players have to be protected to improve the confidence that they have in the system. Now, so far as India is concerned, there was a definite lag in so far as fields such as enforcement of contracts or doing of business is concerned. In fact, uh, I've been contributing regularly to this survey done by World Bank called the Ease of Doing Business. In the survey, based on various parameters, the World Bank ranks various countries in respect of the ease with which one can do business in that particular country. At the time that IBC was contemplated to be introduced, the countries, when they were ranked, India found itself at about 135 or so in the ranking in terms of the ease of doing business. The time period for resolving insolvency or getting dues in course of various legal proceedings was in the excess of 4 years. Whereas in other jurisdictions, other countries, developed nations, it was ranging between about 8 months to a year and a half. So there was a immediate requirement to ensure that the ranking of the country is much higher, and there is a linear method that could be followed by various stakeholders to ensure that the process in which the insolvency goes about is definite and the outcome is more or less well known. So it was with these ideas in mind that the government of India set up the Bankruptcy Law Reforms Committee, BLRC, as we can shortly refer to it. Now, the Bankruptcy Law Reforms Committee flagged that there are some major issues in the manner in which insolvency law is followed in India. So, one of the significant problems was that even after a default, when it comes to insolvency, the debtor remains in control of the entity, and therefore he is more or less in a position to dictate terms to the person to whom he owes money. We're talking about both a corporate debtor, a company, as well as individuals or partnership entities, whatever form the entity is. The overlying scheme of things was that the debtor would remain in control. And this poses several problems. When a creditor comes to negotiate, let us say, to get his debts, he has no clear picture of the financial health of the corporate debtor. He does not know whether they are capable of paying, whether they are capable of surviving further, or it is just a play made by the corporate debtor to beat down the creditor and make him take what we generally call as a significant haircut. That is, if there is a due which we rate at 100%, the haircut is about 40 or 50%. So the creditor gets only half of what he is claiming. The other significant issue that was flagged by the BLRC is that recovery in India was found to be only 20%. I gave an example of about 40-50% being the haircut. But the statistics showed that when the creditor goes to recover the monies, ultimately what comes in his hand is only about 20% of what is owed by the time the entire legal process comes to an end. So the consequence of these two, that is where the debtor remains in control and where the recovery rate is so low, the consequence of these two is that there is an aversion from lending institutions to give money to commercial entities. And this aversion translates into giving money only to such of those entities which have a proven track record and which the creditors know has a very less risk of failure. So, in effect, a company which is already doing well will keep getting more money. Whereas an entity which probably is a very good business idea will not be able to get the required credit for it to be successful and continue its business operations. So opening up of credit availability was a very significant challenge in the old regime. So in the words of the Bankruptcy Law Reforms Committee, what they said is that the foundations of a modern economy stem from well drafted modern laws which will replace laws of 100 years. If you look at the Presidency Towns Insolvency Act, that was enacted in 1909. The Provincial Towns Insolvency Act was enacted in 1920. So these are all acts which are more than 100 years old, and these were ruling the roost. So to replace these with modern laws became the need of the hour, and the Banking Law Reforms Committee set out to do it. When the Banking Law Reforms Committee contemplated a new enactment, they looked towards the UNCITRAL model law. UNCITRAL, in other words, is United Nations Commission on International Trade Laws. UNCITRAL is a subsidiary of the United Nations General Assembly, and it deals with international trade, protects commercial interests of global players. So the role of UNCITRAL is to have conventions, prepare model laws, which will serve as a guidance to various countries so that the laws could be streamlined and in line with what is available the world over. So one of the most well-known examples of an UNCITRAL model law is in the arbitration field, where our Arbitration and Conciliation Act 1996 is modeled very much after the UNCITRAL model law. So similarly, in respect of insolvency as well, there was a model law which was floated by UNCITRAL in the year 2005. This is referred to as a legislative guide to insolvency. This legislative guide serves as one of the guidelines on the basis of which various jurisdictions can frame their local enactments. The model law of UNCITRAL provides for, as I was referring to, a linear process for debtors and creditors to follow while triggering an insolvency resolution process. So there is a set pattern, a method that will not be delineated from by both the creditors and the debtors. So this leaves less room for surprises. The stakeholders are aware that this is the roadmap once CIRP, Corporate Insolvency Resolution Process, is commenced. Now, the other aspect which the model law touched upon was that the resolution of insolvency would be a collective process between the stakeholders that are involved. There would be, in any given case, different kinds of creditors: secured, unsecured, financial, and those who have supplied goods or rendered services to a corporate entity. So the model UNCITRAL law looked at a collective mechanism where there is fairness to all the stakeholders. And most significantly, the model UNCITRAL law also looks at a time-bound mechanism. As I was mentioning, the earlier framework had within its compass, it had taken almost about 4 years before some sort of a resolution could be seen. So therefore, what was most significant was to make it a time-bound process, and this is what the uncitrul model law prescribed. So the objectives are low time for resolution of an insolvency, low time and less loss in recovery for the persons who had lent money or had provided goods or services, and these two lead to higher debt financing to various other entities which require. Now, with this in mind, the Bankruptcy Law Reforms Committee came up with the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. Now, the manner in which the code is different from what was existing earlier is that, firstly, the code separates commercial aspects of insolvency from judicial aspects. So the process of insolvency resolution is left to experts who are well versed in the commercial aspects of the business itself and the commercial aspects of lending and borrowing. The judicial aspect was separated, where after the commercial aspect of resolving the insolvency is finished, then the judicial aspects step in, where they either give their okay or a thumbs up to the process that is already completed, or if that did not work out, take it to the next stage as contemplated under the Act. So there are no surprises, as I was saying. There is a clear demarcation of the roles that are to be played and the manner in which these roles have to be played. The next aspect on which the IBC differs from what existed earlier is that the emphasis is on resolution rather than closing out of the company and taking it to insolvency. Now, for the first time, the law came to be consolidated together in such a manner as to provide a platform whereby the corporate debtor, CD, as is commonly referred to, can come out of insolvency through a resolution process. So the IBC provided for resolution rather than closing down of business. And again, as the uncitrul law specified and prescribed, the entire process is time bound. So the earlier situation which was prevailing was that the overall time limit was mentioned as 270 days with the extensions given. But that became a little blurry, as in the initial stages there were several litigations with respect to interpretation of the Act, challenge to the virus of the Act, etc. And all these were used to extend timelines. Now, after amendments, the overall time limit that has been prescribed is 330 days. And therefore, the CARP process, as we call it, is today time bound. It provides for viability of business and it provides for better negotiation by persons who want to resolve insolvency by providing them with all the information. Now, that is the background of how the code came about. Now, why is this called a code and not an act? The key to that possibly lies in the fact that this enactment seeks to be a complete, exhaustive, and exclusive enactment that deals with insolvency. Now, we are all aware that in the scheme of arrangements in companies, etc., we refer to it as a complete code, where in respect of, let us say, mergers, amalgamations, or any other scheme of arrangement, we don't look beyond the provisions of the Act to deal with such requirements. So when it comes to insolvency as well, the IBC provides a exclusive enactment in this field. You don't need to look at anything beyond this particular enactment to look at what will happen if you go into insolvency. Therefore, it is called as a code. And when we say this is complete, exhaustive, and exclusive, what it all also means is that here is a parliamentary enactment which shuts out all other laws. It overrides all other laws on the subject, even if it is a state law which has been made. So, if you look at the Act itself, there are at least 3 provisions which ensure that no other court other than the adjudicating authority that is specified in the enactment deals with such matters, that there are no other acts which will be looked at by any authority which is dealing with insolvency. I'll just take you through those provisions alone. If you have the code at hand ready, the first of those provisions is section 63. If you look at section 63, it says, civil court not to have jurisdiction. No civil court or authority shall have jurisdiction to entertain any suit or proceedings in respect of any matter on which the National Company Law Tribunal or the National Company Law Appellate Tribunal has jurisdiction. Now, the other provision which is similar is section 231. If you look at section 231, it more or less repeats what has been set out in section 63. I'll read out 231 now. 231 says, bar of jurisdiction. No civil court shall have jurisdiction in respect of any matter in which the adjudicating authority is empowered by or under this code to pass any order, and no injunction shall be granted by any court or other authority in respect of any action taken or to be taken in pursuance of any order passed by such adjudicating authority under this code. Therefore, while section 231 starts off with a bar on the jurisdiction of civil court, it thereafter expands the scope to include all other courts and authorities and says no injunction or orders can be passed by any court. The third provision, which will establish the supremacy of IBC, is section 238. Section 238 says that the provisions of this code will override other laws. It reads, the provisions of this code shall have effect notwithstanding anything inconsistent therewith contained in any other law for the time being in force or any instrument having effect by virtue of any such law. Therefore, reading these 3 sections together, section 63, section 231 and section 238, it is very clear that IBC seeks to serve as the only legislation when it comes to dealing with matters concerning insolvency. I just mention also one other provision which is in respect of insolvency of partners and individuals, partnership firms and individuals, etc. So that comes under section 180, and that is pari materia with 231, except that 231 would speak about NCLT and NCLAT, whereas 180 would speak of DRT and DRAT, because individual insolvency is left to DRT and DRAT as the notified adjudicating authority. Now, therefore, this is probably called as a code and not an act. Now, we get back to the enactment itself. Now, what does the code provide for? The code is separated, if we look at the scheme of the act, the code is separated into 5 parts, each part dealing with a different aspect of the insolvency law. Part 1, of course, is a general part which has application throughout the code, and it contains definition sections and other general aspects. That is more or less a preliminary to what is to follow in the other parts. Part 2 is very significant because that is the part which is, as of today, most notified in terms of the provisions contained therein. And it is part 2 that is, as of today, being put to practice rigorously and on a day-to-day basis. Part 2 deals with insolvency of corporate persons. I'll just run through the scheme of the act and then we will go back to part 2. Part 3 speaks about insolvency resolution and bankruptcy of individuals and partnership. So what you will see is in the act, when it comes to corporate persons, there is resolution and thereafter liquidation. When it comes to individuals and partnerships, there is, instead of liquidation, what is called as bankruptcy. There again, it provides for resolution in a different manner. But after the period of resolution is over, and if it is not successful, what follows is a process called bankruptcy. Therefore, insolvency and bankruptcy code. Part 4 is with respect to the professionals who are involved in respect of implementing the various provisions of the act to ensure that this goes in the manner that it is supposed to be done. And part 5 is miscellaneous provisions. It is in part 5 that we have sections 231, 238, etc., which speak about overriding effect of IBC and bar of jurisdiction of courts, etc. So those are the miscellaneous provisions. Part 3, insofar as personal guarantees to corporate debtors are concerned, has been notified as of 1st of December 2019. And DRT and DRET are the designated adjudicating authorities to deal with this. Now, in course of this lecture, we will primarily look at part 2, given the time that we have and the depth of the subject. I think we'll confine ourselves to corporate insolvency resolution. And as I was saying, that is the field which is currently more put to practice than individual insolvency. We may not have time to go into part 3. Now, when we take part 2 starts from sections 4 onwards. Sections 1 to 3, as I was saying, which is in part 1, are general sections. Section 3 contains definitions which are applicable throughout the code. There are definitions on what is debt, what is a claim. All that is found in part 1, and that is applicable throughout the code. Part 2 also contains definitions, but these are definitions which are applicable only to that part. So these are definitions which are applicable to corporate insolvency resolution. Now, that is found in section 5. I will not trouble you all with the definitions. We will straight away move on to section 6. Now, section 6 specifies who are all entitled to initiate insolvency resolution process. So, for the first time, the code creates different categories of creditors. So, under the code, there is a financial creditor, there are operational creditors. So, these are two broad categories of creditors which the code has brought in. Now, in a very broad-based manner, financial creditors are those who have given money to the corporate debtor to the company, or there is time value to the financial facilities which have been provided, which is basically that there is a interest component to the lending or the facility that has been financial facility that has been provided. The other category of creditors referred to as operational creditors are those who have rendered some form of service or have supplied goods to the corporate debtor, and on the basis of which they are entitled to get some money from the corporate debtor. Now, when we talk about provision of services, it also includes employees who have worked for the company who are probably not paid salaries. In the existing regime, before the IBC came into force, the only mode was to file a suit for such employees who have not received salaries, let's say. The only mode was to file a civil suit. Even winding up proceedings could not be initiated because under the winding up proceedings, it had to be a clear and undisputed debt, whereas a salary was not even looked at as a debt. So, for the first time, employees who had not been paid salaries could also approach the NCLT as the adjudicating authority and trigger a corporate insolvency resolution process. So, there are, as per Section 6, 3 categories of persons who can initiate corporate insolvency resolution process. The first of such category is a financial creditor. The second category is an operational creditor. And lastly, the corporate debtor itself could initiate a insolvency resolution process on itself. So these are the 3 categories of persons who can trigger insolvency resolution process. Now, how do these categories of creditors go ahead with such triggering of the process? A financial creditor is placed on a higher pedestal by the IBC. When it comes to a financial creditor, there is not even a requirement for a financial creditor to give a notice to the corporate debtor before triggering the process. So all that a financial creditor would require to do is file the application wherein he would show that there is a default and therefore there is money due and payable to the financial creditor, and that is where it ends. I must also mention that there is a threshold for initiating CARP, whether it is by a financial creditor or by an operational creditor. The code, when it came in originally, had the threshold as rupees 1 lakh. This is mentioned in section 4 of the IBC, and the threshold has now been increased to 1 crore. In fact, section 4 specifically says that this threshold can be increased, but it cannot exceed 1 crore. Recently, a notification has come in whereby this threshold for initiating corporate insolvency resolution process has moved from 1 lakh to 1 crore. Therefore, earlier when the code came into force initially, if there was a default or a debt to the extent of above 1 lakh, CARP proceedings could be initiated by a financial creditor or a operational creditor. After the latest notification, this threshold has become 1 crore, and therefore unless the amount owed is 1 crore and more, you cannot trigger CARP proceedings. Now, getting back to section 7, the financial creditor will make out an application in the prescribed format with all details mentioned completely and presented before the adjudicating authority, which is the NCLT. Upon such application being filed, the only aspect which the financial creditor would need to show is that there is money due and payable. If that has been established, the NCLT has no other option but to initiate the CARP proceedings by admitting the application. Now, this leaves the question as to what could be the defenses that are available to a corporate debtor in such an event. The defenses are not very many and they are set out in section 7 itself. All that a corporate debtor in a CARP proceedings triggered by a financial creditor can do is that the amount that is claimed is not due and payable either in law or on fact. Now, when you look at financial creditors, most of the dealings between financial creditors and the entity undergoing CARP or in respect of which it has been triggered would be through documents, through contracts. So it is all very clearly documented and the payment obligations are clearly set out and a default is very easy to prove. Even a single installment, let us say, which is not paid, will be taken as a default definitely and a debt which is due and payable. And that can empower the financial creditor to initiate CARP proceedings. Then comes the next category of persons who can initiate such CARP proceedings, and that is the category of operational creditors. Operational creditors have to follow a slightly different mechanism when it comes to initiation of CARP proceedings. An operational creditor has to give what is called as a demand notice. Section 8 provides for this. The operational creditor gives a demand notice to the corporate debtor where he sets out the default in terms of the invoices which have not been paid or whatever is the amount due. Section 8 provides that on receipt of such a notice of demand, the corporate debtor has to raise a dispute. If he is disputing, he has to raise a dispute by giving a response within 10 days of receipt of the notice of demand. Of course, when I say that the corporate debtor has to raise a dispute, it is not that it is mandatory for you to raise the dispute. If there is a dispute, then that has to be done within a period of 10 days of receiving the notice of demand. Now, the dispute that is raised must be one which is pre-existing and which is documented. I'll come to that aspect of it when I touch upon the case laws on the point. But for the response to be taken as a what is referred to as a notice of dispute, it should be in respect of a pre-existing dispute. The Act, when it was originally framed, referred to disputes which were pending in terms of a civil suit or arbitration. Jurisprudence is evolved to make this a little more wider, but this is how the Act was framed. The other aspect, of course, is that within this period of 10 days, the corporate debtor can produce proof to show that the claim that is being made by the operational creditor has in fact been satisfied already, in terms of payment made or a check issued which has been encashed. And if the proof of that is provided, then CARP proceedings cannot be triggered. Now, this is what is set out in Section 8. Once the notice of demand is sent, and let us assume either a notice of dispute is given or no notice of dispute is given, the next step is to file the application under Section 9. In the event that the operational creditor deems that the notice of dispute raised by the corporate debtor is incorrect or sham, or if there has been no notice of dispute at all, the operational creditor will initiate CARP proceedings by filing an application under Section 9. Now, the notice of demand is in a specific form which is set out in the IBC itself. The notice would be sent in that form, that manner. Likewise, the application that is filed under Section 9 also follows a particular format that is also set out in the code itself. Now, once such an application is filed, then the adjudicating authority looks at whether, firstly, whether the application is complete in all respects. If it is not complete as required by the code, an opportunity is given to the operational creditor to rectify the defects, and he is given a time of 7 days. If that is not done, then the application stands dismissed. In the event the application is complete in all respects, then the CARP proceedings gets triggered as soon as it is seen that there is no notice of dispute. In the event that there is a notice of dispute, the adjudicating authority considers what is set out in that notice of dispute to determine whether it is a sham or an illusory response that is given to the notice of demand, or whether it is in fact correct and therefore there is a dispute in existence. So we are now therefore talking basically about the defenses that are available to a corporate debtor when CARP proceedings are initiated by an operational creditor. The basic defense would be that there is a pre-existing dispute. Such a pre-existing dispute could be in the form of a pending litigation, a civil suit or an arbitration or something else before an authority, or that the money is actually not owed. Let us say we are talking about provision of services or supply of goods, that there was dispute on quality, and these disputes, or with respect to provision of services, these disputes have been raised even earlier in terms of communication between the parties. All these could be shown to say that the CARP proceedings cannot be triggered and the application has to be dismissed. If all these are absent, or the adjudicating authority comes to a conclusion that it is not a tenable or what can be called as a notice of dispute, then the application will have to be admitted and CARP proceedings get triggered. Now, originally the timelines were very strict in the Act in respect of financial creditors as well as operational creditors. For operational creditors, within 14 days, the application had to be decided. For financial creditors, 7 days, but these timelines have become a little blurred by judicial interpretation, as it is practically not possible to do it within such 7 days or 14 days. Be that as it may, it is still time bound and it takes place at a much greater pace than what we are used in conventional court proceedings. Now, once the application is admitted, CARP proceedings commence. Now, the third category of persons who can initiate CARP proceedings is set out in Section 10. As I was mentioning, it is the corporate debtor itself. If the corporate debtor wishes to initiate insolvency resolution process, it can do so itself by moving an application under Section 10 of the IBC. Now, this is not to be confused with a voluntary winding up. The essence of IBC is that the first stage will be resolution, and therefore to provide for resolution, Section 10 has come in, whereby even the corporate debtor can by itself approach the adjudicating authority seeking resolution. Now, insofar as proceedings akin to voluntary winding up is concerned, that is found in Section 59 of the code, which speaks about voluntary liquidation. The corporate debtor goes in with an application for liquidation. So, therefore, Section 10 is not to be confused with voluntary winding up, and that is dealt with separately at Section 59. Now, the code also speaks about persons who cannot initiate CARP proceedings. And that category is a very limited category that is set out in Section 11. If it is a corporate debtor which is already undergoing insolvency proceedings, then it cannot file an application under Section 10 to initiate CARP. It is already under CARP proceedings which have been initiated by some other creditor. Therefore, you cannot try to say, now I am initiating it myself. Now, a corporate debtor which has already undergone this CARP process in the last 12 months, such a corporate debtor also cannot initiate CARP proceedings, or CARP proceedings cannot be initiated in respect of such corporate debtor. Thirdly, as I was saying, the code provides for resolution of insolvency. So, who's to resolve the insolvency? It is a resolution applicant. So, either the CD, the corporate debtor, or a financial creditor which has violated any part of a resolution plan which has been brought in to resolve the corporate insolvency, they cannot initiate CARP proceedings. So there is a plan which is in place. The plan required certain obligations of the corporate debtor or of the financial creditor, but they have violated. They cannot take advantage of that violation and then come and file another application under this chapter to say I am initiating CARP process. And the last of such categories where CARP cannot be initiated is where there is a corporate debtor which has gone into liquidation. Once the corporate debtor has already gone into liquidation, the question of commencing CARP proceedings does not arise at all. Now, the intent of the lawmakers, as I had mentioned, was to ensure that the entire process is a time-bound process. Therefore, to make the timelines very strict, Section 12 has been enacted in the code. Section 12 provides for the time frames within which the CARP proceedings have to be completed. As I was saying, originally the time provided was 180 days, which could be extended further by 90 days. Therefore, a total of 270. But on account of various litigation, there was in the initial stages a lot of time taken in completing the process, and the time spent on such litigation was excluded or added to the time periods provided under Section 12 to extend the period of CIRP, and in some cases it went beyond even 600 days. Now, an amendment has been brought in whereby the maximum time period provided, including the time spent in litigation or otherwise, is capped at 330 days. Therefore, it cannot extend beyond 330 days. And even within this period of 330 days, because that is the outer limit, the original timelines of 180 days, 270 days are very much there. And the section provides that you can approach the NCLT seeking only one extension. However, that has been watered down slightly by subsequent judicial pronouncement, where if it is on account of an act of the court that there has been a delay, then such period can be excluded. But then again, the overall time limit cannot exceed 330 days. Now, what happens once the application has been admitted? Now is the most significant provision which is relied upon by most practitioners in other fora to take advantage of the CIRP proceedings sometimes. This is the declaration of what is called as a moratorium. Section 13 provides that on the admission of an application, the adjudicating authority will declare a moratorium, which is referred to or set out in greater detail in Section 14. Not only is a moratorium declared, a public announcement has to be made by the insolvency resolution professional. Now, what happens when CIRP proceedings are triggered either by an application under Section 7 or Section 9 is that the creditor, financial creditor or the operational creditor is given the option of proposing the name of an insolvency resolution professional. An insolvency resolution professional is the expert who will manage the affairs of the corporate debtor till such time that the corporate debtor's insolvency is not resolved. Till such time, the insolvency resolution professional is put in charge. Now, there are 4 different categories of persons who could be insolvency resolution professionals. One is a chartered accountant. The other category is a company secretary. The third category is a cost and works accountant. And the last category is an advocate. Now, any one of these 4 could be a insolvency resolution professional. However, they have to be accredited to a insolvency professional agency. Only then they can be appointed as a insolvency resolution professional. This agency is in turn overseen by the IBBA, the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board of India. Now, of these categories of 4 persons that I mentioned who could be insolvency resolution professionals or IRPs, the Institute of Chartered Accountants, the Institute of Cost Accountants, and the Institute of Company Secretaries have formed such professional agencies, whereas the Bar Council is yet to form such an agency. So, some of the advocates have used the other agencies which have already been formed to become insolvency resolution professionals. Now, these insolvency resolution professionals can be chosen by the operational creditor or the financial creditor while making the application they give a declaration from the proposed insolvency resolution professional that he does not face any bar or proceedings of any nature which prevents him from discharging his duties as a IRP. On the basis of such a declaration, the named insolvency resolution professional is appointed when the application is admitted. Now, once the IRP has been appointed, he is originally called as an interim resolution professional. That is, he is there for a period of time till a particular event takes place. Now, this interim resolution professional will have to make a public announcement within a period of 3 days of admission of the application. The public announcement will contain the name of the company which is now undergoing insolvency, and it will call for claims from all persons who are creditors to whom it is said that money is owed. So the departure from the earlier scheme of things was where the official liquidator would collate all the data and he would send notices to all the creditors for them to make a claim. Now, that is completely gone away under the IBC, and the only notice is by way of a public notice, and it is for the creditors to look at it and on that basis make a claim before the insolvency resolution professional. Now, I'll come to the question of the role of the IRP and his duties a little later. We will move on to moratorium. Section 14 speaks about a moratorium on the proceedings once the CARP proceedings are triggered and the application has been admitted. Now, a moratorium is what is referred to as a standstill period. The object of IBC was to maximize asset value for the corporate debtor so that it is attractive to a prospective resolution applicant to take over the company, resolve the insolvency. To maximize the value, therefore, all legal proceedings had to be stopped. There could be suits or some other proceedings before authorities, and by letting such proceedings continue, there would be erosion in value of the corporate debtor. So, to prevent such erosion of value and to preserve value, the moratorium is introduced whereby any pending legal proceedings before any courts or authorities is completely brought to a standstill. No new proceedings can be initiated as against the corporate debtor before any court. The execution of any judgment or decree is also put to a complete stop. Now, this moratorium is to continue till such period the resolution does not take place. So, section 14 provides for when the moratorium comes to an end. If you look at section 14.4, it says the order of moratorium shall have effect from the date of such order till completion of the corporate insolvency resolution process. So, until the corporate insolvency resolution process is over, the moratorium will continue. Now, significantly, there is a reference to the end of moratorium in section 31 as well. If you look at section 31.3, if you look at section 31(3), after the order of approval under subsection 31, the moratorium order passed by adjudicating authority under section 14 shall cease to have effect. This is to say, A, under section 14, the moratorium will come to an end when the resolution process is completed. Now, reading that with section 31 speaks about a situation where a resolution plan is approved. Once the resolution plan is approved, then there is no requirement for the moratorium to continue. And that brings an end to the insolvency resolution process. So once the moratorium comes to an end, the insolvency resolution process, the moratorium also comes to an end. So this is referred to in section 14(4) as well as section 31(3). Now, once the moratorium has come in, what the IRP is required to do, as I said, a public announcement has to be made, and then claims have to be called for. Now, the other significant role which the IRP has to play is in forming what is called as the Committee of Creditors. Now, Committee of Creditors is the sort of body which will oversee this entire process. This Committee of Creditors consists of only the financial creditors. Now, that is in keeping with the scheme of the Act, where primacy is given to persons who have put in their money into the corporate debtor for its functioning. So the financial creditors have an upper hand and they form the Committee of Creditors. Now, the Committee of Creditors at its first meeting can either replace the interim resolution professional originally appointed by the adjudicating authority with another interim resolution professional, or they can make the interim resolution professional who was appointed as the resolution professional. So that choice is given to the Committee of Creditors. Of course, once there is a change, a formal application will have to be moved before the adjudicating authority. The adjudicating authority refers this to the IBBI. The IBBI looks at whether the resolution professional who is now sought to be brought in, changing the one who is earlier appointed, is one who is fit in as much as there are no proceedings against him, etc. And thereafter, it is approved and the new resolution professional takes charge. Now, once the COC has been formed, it takes over the significant decision making. Now, the Act provides for percentages of voting for getting a resolution plan approved and for other decisions. Decisions which are day-to-day matters can be passed with 50% vote, whereas significant decisions such as approval of a resolution plan would require 66%. Originally, when the Act was notified, the percentage of voting that was required was 75%. Now it has come down to 66%. So therefore, if 66% of the Committee of Creditors approve something, that is taken to be good enough. Now, the interim resolution professional, as I said, continues till the first COC meeting and thereafter becomes a resolution professional. Now, once the resolution professional takes charge, what are his duties and roles? The resolution professional has to collate the claims. Now, he is given a public announcement. Based on the public announcement, there are claims that are being made by various creditors. So the term that is used in the Act is that the resolution professional will collect and collate such claims. So when we say collate, it means that he has to receive the claim and compare it with the data which is available with the corporate data. And on that basis, prepare a document. Now, the resolution professional will prepare a document which gives a snapshot of the financial health of the company. What are the assets available? What are the liabilities? What are the claims that have come in? So this forms the basis for a prospective resolution applicant to look at the company and submit what is called as a resolution plan. Now, this document which will be prepared by the resolution professional is called as the information memorandum, or IM. So on the basis of the information memorandum, a resolution applicant will make his bid, so to say, to take over the corporate debtor. I'm putting it in rather simple terms. Now, the precursor to a resolution plan being submitted is an expression of interest. On the basis of the data available, a proposed resolution applicant or a possible resolution applicant would give his expression of interest. In the expression of interest, the resolution applicant will state that there is no bar in him making an expression of interest or in submitting a resolution plan. So on the basis of that undertaking, the information memorandum is provided, and basing the offer on the information memorandum, a resolution plan is prepared by the resolution applicant. Now, originally, what was happening was that the erstwhile promoters were themselves submitting resolution plans, having defaulted, having taken the company to a stage where CIRP proceedings had to be triggered. The very same persons would step in as resolution applicants to take over the company, so to say. So this was sought to be put an end to by introduction of section 29 capital A to the IBC. Section 29 capital A introduces the category of persons who are prevented from submitting resolution plans. It is very broad. Erstwhile promoters cannot do it. Related parties do not get a chance to make a bid. The exemptions that are made available under 29A is to micro, small and medium enterprises. Insofar as MSMEs are concerned, the promoters themselves can submit a resolution plan. Similarly, the bar under 29 capital A will not apply to financial creditors or, let us say, asset reconstruction companies. In course of business, the corporate debtor would have had a relationship with them, but they will not be barred from submitting a resolution plan. So this is set out in section 29 capital A. Now, in respect of the committee of creditors, I have already set out that these comprise only of financial creditors. Operational creditors are not part of the committee of creditors for the purpose of decision making. And if at all, if the amount due to operational creditors exceeds a particular value, they get one representative representing the entire class of operational creditors to be present at COC meetings, and they do not get any right to vote. Now, this is how the committee of creditors would function. Now, the committee of creditors is the expert body which will ultimately evaluate the resolution plan which is submitted by a resolution applicant. The duty of the resolution professional would be to provide all the data to possible applicants and get the resolution plans from them and then place it before the committee of creditors for evaluation. The committee of creditors would evaluate the resolution plan and either pass or rather approve the resolution plan by putting it to vote or reject it as the case may be. If the resolution plan is approved by the committee of creditors, then it will have to be placed for a seal of approval from the adjudicating authority, namely the NCLT. The NCLT will satisfy itself that the resolution plan meets all the criteria that is set out in section 32 and 34, whatever are the requirements which are set out in terms of those provisions. See that this resolution applicant is in fact not barred from making such a plan or proposal. It will ensure that the stakeholders involved are all treated fairly and equally. Now, when we talk about equal treatment of the various stakeholders, we are talking about equal treatment within categories. It is not that the financial creditors and the operational creditors have to be treated equally. It is that from among the financial creditors, all of them will be treated fairly and in the same manner. Secured creditors will be treated in the same manner. Unsecured creditors will be treated, all unsecured creditors will be treated in the same manner as one of the unsecured creditor is treated. And likewise, there will be no distinction between operational creditors inter se, and all of them will be treated equally. Therefore, if it is a pro rata disbursement of whatever money comes in, it will be an equal sort of a percentage to all the operational creditors. That's how the code works. Now, when it comes to the priority in making payments, we move to section 53. Section 53 contains what is called as a waterfall mechanism. Now, why is it called a waterfall mechanism? Is that imagine a fountain. The water flows into the top tier, and once the water gets filled in that tier, what is left over spills to the next level. So if there are different levels in the waterfall, then it spills over from one level to another. So section 53 provides such a mechanism where among the various categories of persons which are available, each one is exhausted first and then the next category is moved. So in a departure from the earlier system available, the debts to crown also fall much below what is paid to a financial creditor. The financial creditor gets the primacy as per section 53. Now I'll just sort of round up this overview because we are running out of time, and I'll just move on to the journey so far in terms of the amendments. And I hope that from whatever I have touched upon now, the process that is followed is something that I've been able to explain to all of you. Now, when we look at the journey so far, as I was mentioning, the Act, though it is in a nascent stage, has already seen several amendments. So the first of the amendments took place in 2017 itself. The significant aspects of the 2017 amendment was to say that the moratorium under section 14 cannot be taken advantage of by a personal guarantor. The second critical amendment in the 2017 amendment was the introduction of section 29 capital A, whereby related parties could not bid for the could not submit resolution plans. Subsequently, in 2018, there were two sets of amendments. The first amendment in 2018 brought in home buyers as financial creditors. So what was happening previously was that in respect of builders, a lot of money had been taken by them from home buyers, and projects were either not completed or abandoned, or the company went into CARP. So the persons who had put in money, the home buyers, were left high and dry. There were litigations also which arose from such scenarios, which went right up to the Honorable Supreme Court. So in light of all that, the first amendment in 2018 brought in the concept of home buyers as financial creditors. So being financial creditors, therefore, they could initiate CARP proceedings without giving a notice. The other significant aspect of the first amendment that came in 2018 was that the voting percentage was reduced from 75% to 66% for the resolutions to be passed in a committee of creditors. One other aspect of the first amendment in 2018 was that after the admission of the application by the adjudicating authority, if the committee of creditors had not been formed, the operational creditor or financial creditor, as the case may be, could withdraw the application. If the committee of creditors had been formed, then by a voting percentage of 90%, the application could be withdrawn with the agreement of all the creditors. Now, the second amendment that came about in 2018 was that the resolution plan will also have to be approved by the Competition Commission of India. That is one small significant amendment that came in the latter part of 2018. In 2019, again, there were two amendments. The first of the amendments in 2019 brought about the concept of 330 days as the overall time period for completion of the CARP process. The 2019 amendment also set out very clearly that the resolution plan will be binding on all stakeholders, including the government undertakings, the government. In 2019, there was a second amendment again, where the threshold limit for home buyers to initiate proceedings under the IBC was increased to say that at least 100 home buyers or 10% of the buyers, whichever is lesser, can initiate CARP proceedings. Now, this amendment is under challenge before the Honorable Supreme Court, and there is a status quo order that is granted. So as of now, proceedings which have been initiated by home buyers is kept in limbo until a decision is taken on the validity of the increase of the threshold limit. The other aspect that I will need to bring to your attention, which I've already mentioned, is the notification by which the threshold limit has been increased in section 4 from 1 lakh to 1 crore. So these are the amendments that have come about from 2016 when the act was notified till date. I'll just quickly move on to some of the significant case laws in respect of IBC. So the first of the case laws that sort of explored the contours of IBC in entirety is the decision which is reported in 2018 1 SEC 407. 2018 volume 1 SEC page 407. Now this is the case of Innovative Industries Private Limited versus ICICI and others. Now this was a case where a financial creditor initiated CIRP proceedings. A stand was taken that there is a special enactment in terms of the Maharashtra Debt Relief Act, and that will prove as a bar to the CIRP proceedings. The Honorable Supreme Court held in this decision that the IBC is a complete, exclusive and exhaustive code in respect of insolvency. It said that any repugnancy through any other enactment will not matter at all, and it is IBC which will prevail. One other aspect which was laid down in this decision is that erstwhile directors can no longer represent the company and file appeals. Now, what I missed mentioning when I was speaking about the provisions of the Act was that the Act provides for initiation at NCLT. There is an appeal that is provided to NCLAT and a further appeal to the Honorable Supreme Court. So this is the scheme of the Act, and it flows in the same manner even where individual insolvencies are concerned, where it will be DRT, DRAT and Supreme Court. So this is the manner in which it proceeds. So if the CIRP proceedings have been triggered and the company goes into insolvency, then the appeal, let us say that the directors are unhappy with the initiation of the proceedings or the admission of the application, the appeal that the directors can file cannot be in their capacity as a representative of the corporate debtor, but it should only be as erstwhile directors. They can no longer maintain an appeal on behalf of the company. The decision also very clearly set out that there are different contours when it comes to CIRP proceedings initiated by a financial creditor and CIRP proceedings initiated by an operational creditor. And the decision also says, as long as there is a debt which is due, it is therefore payable and the application will have to be admitted. This is all in the context of a financial creditor. The next significant decision in this field is reported in 2018, Volume 1 SEC, page 353. 2018, Volume 1 SEC, page 353. This is the case of Mobilox Innovations versus Kirusa Software. Mobilox Innovations versus Kirusa Software. I'll repeat the citation again. 2018, 1 SEC, page 353. Now, what this decision set out is where it is a CIRP proceedings initiated by an operational creditor, the code will not be followed in a very pedantic manner. That is to say, you will only have to show that there was a pre-existing civil suit or an arbitration. The Honorable Supreme Court said that if there is a pre-existing dispute which can be shown as something which is plausible and the adjudicating authority satisfies itself that there is some material which shows a plausible dispute which is pre-existing before the notice initiating CIRP proceedings under Section 8 was given, then the adjudicating authority can hold that there is a dispute and therefore the application cannot be allowed. It cannot be admitted. Now, what the Honorable Supreme Court also says is that while the dispute must be pre-existing, it is sufficient that it is shown that it is a plausible contention. The adjudicating authority need not satisfy itself that the corporate debtor will definitely succeed. He may even fail. But if it is a plausible contention, that is sufficient to say that the dispute, there is a pre-existing dispute and therefore the application cannot be admitted. The next significant decision is one which is reported in 2019, Volume 4, SEC, page 17. 2019, Volume 4, SEC, page 17. This is the case of Swiss Ribbons versus Union of India. This is where the virus of the act came to be challenged on various bases. One of the contentions that was raised was that there is a classification which is created in terms of financial creditors and operational creditors, and this is discriminatory. The denial of a right to vote in the committee of creditors for the operational creditors is also discriminatory. Then permitting withdrawal on 90% of the committee of creditors agreeing to it, that was also challenged as being discriminatory. The exclusion of erstwhile promoters by bringing in section 29A was also said to be something which is ultra virus. The exemption granted to MSMEs was also brought to challenge, and the waterfall mechanism prescribed under section 53 was also called to question. The Honorable Supreme Court negatived all these challenges, upheld the constitutional validity of the act, and said that none of these aspects are discriminatory and all these are in keeping with the objects of the code. One other aspect which the Supreme Court decided in course of this proceedings was to say that a resolution professional does not perform any adjudicatory powers. He only collates, prepares the claims for consideration by the committee of creditors or used by the resolution applicant. The next significant decision is one which is reported in 2019 SEC Online, 2019 SEC Online SC 1478, 2019 SEC Online Supreme Court 1478. This is the case of Committee of Creditors of SR Steel versus Satish Kumar Gupta. Now, this is a exhaustive decision once again, but one of the most significant aspects in respect of this decision is that section 60 subclause 6 was interpreted by the Honorable Supreme Court. Section 60 subclause 6 was held by the NCLAT as providing an escape route to such of those creditors who had not submitted claims before the resolution professional. Now, what the NCLAT said is that by virtue of section 66, you can file your claims later on. So this created a situation where several creditors made their claims before the resolution professional and had to take what is provided in the resolution plan, whereas some persons who did not make such claims could revive their entire original claim by initiating such proceedings. The Honorable Supreme Court at paragraph 88 of this judgment very clearly says that such a course is impermissible. All creditors have to make their claims before the RP and have to go by whatever the resolution plan provides. If they have not made any claim, then they have missed the bus and they cannot subsequently initiate any proceedings seeking to recover that kind of money or the claim. The last decision that I will touch upon, incidentally, when I'm referring to 2019 SEC Online SC 1478, I should also speak about a decision rendered by our Honorable High Court with respect to rejection of plaint. This was a case where a suit was filed when the moratorium came to effect. When the moratorium had been triggered, one of the creditors filed a civil suit making a claim. So the corporate debtor moved an application for rejection of plaint. The Honorable High Court, relying upon paragraph 88 of this decision, held that such a claim would not be maintainable. The very filing of the suit itself was incorrect and therefore rejected the plaint. The cause title is Sheenlak Nuru Private Limited versus Tata Steel BSL Limited. This is an unreported judgment, but has some significance because it is held that suits which are filed subsequent to the moratorium being declared cannot lie. The last of the decisions that I will cite to you will be the one reported in 2019 SEC Online, Supreme Court 1542. 2019 SEC Online, Supreme Court 1542. This is the case of Embassy Property Development Private Limited versus State of Karnataka and others. So the questions that arose in this case was whether proceedings could be initiated under Article 226 or 227 of the Constitution. What would be the scope of the power of judicial review of the High Court in respect of IBC matters, and whether the NCLT could decide issues of fraud. The Honorable Supreme Court answered these questions by setting out that where the corporate debtor seeks to exercise a right which falls outside the purview of IBC, which is in the nature of some public right governed by some other statute, then it falls outside the purview of IBC, and therefore the High Court can exercise its superintendence through Article 226 or 227. That is what the Honorable Supreme Court held. Answering the question of whether the NCLT can go into issues of fraud in initiation of proceedings under the IBC, the Honorable Supreme Court said that the Act provides for it, and therefore the NCLT and consequentially the NCLAT also has power to decide questions of fraud in initiation of CARP proceedings. These are broadly the decisions which touch upon various aspects of the IBC so far. These are the most significant ones. There are several others which speak about related party transactions, which speak about preferential transactions, avoidance transactions, etc., which are set out between sections 43 and 49 of the code. So I'm not touching upon all that for the present. As I started off, this lecture is more to bring in people to practice IBC, and this is for the benefit of persons who are starting off on this practice and not for the persons who are already seasoned and well versed with this aspect. I think I've taken up quite a bit of time, so I'll stop now, and I'll thank Suri straight away for giving me this opportunity.